Hello and welcome. This is a presentation for EGT1, Task 4 on cultural sensitivity. My name is Wade Roberts, and I will be your guide through this task. I'm a course mentor here at WGU. My PhD is in economics from the University of Utah, and I specifically focused in development, labor, public health, and gender. Development really is very related to the task that we're about to discuss. My current research has to do with microfinance in Cambodia. As you start this task, there are several chapters in the ball text that you need to be aware of, several ideas that come from each of these chapters that will be relevant for this task. Specifically, you need to read chapters 5, 11, 14, 15, 16, and 17 of the ball text. Also, it's very critical that you understand that you're going to be needing to do some research of your own contingent on the country that you select for this task. The country that you select will be somewhere in Asia, is specified as such for the task requirements. But you can select any country inside of Asia according to your whim. As you conduct your research, there are several areas that you should be aware of that you can look online for information. You can perform a basic search using a platform such as Google or one of those. You can also use the WGU library, which I highly recommend. This does go beyond the surface level searches like Google and does get into the deep web affiliates. You can also use Scopus or JSTOR. Here you can look at the literature and search by topic and find what's been published on specific topics. Also, you're welcome to look at government websites. You can either look through the United States perspective, looking through a CIA lens, for example, or you can go to the country that you select for the task and do a search on the ministries of Asia, of the Asian country that you select, and try to find information in that direction. You're also welcome to look at different news articles, the Asia Time, or country-specific news for the country that you select. There's really no limit to the scope in which you can apply the database or searches for acquiring information for this task. In an introduction to this task, you're given kind of a setup that reads as follows. Businesses large and small now compete in a truly global economy. To be successful in another country, it is essential to understand and appreciate the cultural differences that exist. Business practices and ideas that work well here in the United States may not necessarily be expected to do so in other cultural environments. Following this, you're told that if you were to consider expanding your current business into an Asian country, what cross-cultural challenges might you encounter? So we've got kind of a setup here, a foundation where there's some sort of premise of a business existing. And as that business exists, you're looking at expanding into Asia. This is a very realistic task in the sense that many organizations are considering the transfer or the move to Asian countries specifically. China and India get a large percentage of the business and labor contracts from the Western countries. The first thing that you'll need to do as you move forward with this task is you'll need to make a choice in regards to which country you're going to work with here. So you do need to pick one country, and it does need to be a, quote, Asian country. Now, according to either CIA or United Nations definitions, you're going to find something similar to the map here provided. Okay, essentially, you need to pick a country that you think would be relevant. A lot of people pick either China or something in Southeast Asia or Japan or something like the Philippines, Indonesia. Okay, but this is kind of your guide and limitation to really the countries that you should have your eye towards. You can do a search on the CIA websites or with United Nations in an effort to verify that the country you select is indeed considered to be, quote, Asian. Element A asks you to discuss three major cross-cultural differences that would need to be taken into consideration if your company were to expand into this market based on your selected country. So this is really the first thing you need to do after you select the country that you want to work with. So there's really no limit here. I've put up some foundational works and categories that we're going to talk about, but really don't think of this as something that's comprehensive. There's certainly much more, and there's different ways of perceiving these realities. So you can do some research on your own, you can read the chapters in the ball text, and you can look at anything that is considered to be an academic resource online in an effort to expand beyond this. This is certainly something that you could use as comprehensive, but if you find that you would like to expand your knowledge base beyond what I have to offer here, please feel free to continue the research on your own. We're going to look at the first two of these here. We're going to look at first language, and I'm going to break it down into three different types of language: written, spoken, and body language. And then we're also going to consider this next element here, communication challenges. And there's one body of literature that talks about 6 fundamental patterns. And we're going to consider each of those fundamental patterns in comparing the different cultures from a Western to an Eastern or Asian country. You can also consider environmental resources, legal, labor, and sex and gender as categories of their own. We're not going to have time to put that forth here. Let's start with language, and specifically inside of language, let's look at written language. When you're considering expanding business abroad, you would have to consider that some information would have to be relayed perhaps in written form. And translation obviously becomes an issue. Transliteration is another issue. It's related, it's different. Also, you need to be concerned about a meaning transfer. So words don't always translate directly across the board. They can have multiple meanings, for example. Okay? So the way that words are broken down in one language may not be broken down the same way in other languages, and that can cause some complications. So, for example, my background in history is primarily in Cambodian. I speak Cambodian, and I've spent a great deal of time in that country doing research. And as I break down the language and look at how some words are built differently, they're structurally different. The word, for example, to know, okay, in English we use that word very broadly. In Cambodian it's broken down into 3 very distinct categories. You can know a person, which is to squall. You can know a fact, which the translation is to dang. Or you can also know how to do something, which is jia. And all 3 of those words are very distinct in the knowledge application, whereas in English we can just say universally and across the board to know, and it applies. So these types of things complicate situations when you're trying to expand business and you run into the written language. Now, there are also formalities in writing, and there are some very distinct subtleties that perhaps you should be considering. For example, the size of font that you use, variance in font size, whether there's conformity or there's variation there. You would also perhaps even have to consider things such as the color of ink you use. For example, in Cambodia, using red ink is not something I suggest that you do. There's a great deal of history from the 1970s, specifically 1975 to 1979, when the Khmer Rouge, which was a communist-based faction that took the country over, and as they operated for about 3.5 years in that country, they also committed one of the most horrendous genocides in the history of our world. And one of the things that took place throughout that period was, as people were put on lists to be questioned or criticized, and they ultimately usually ended up being tortured and killed, their name was written with red ink. And because of that, 30 years later, we still have this deeply ingrained and embedded concept in written language where over there, if you use a pen with red ink to write specifically someone's name, this is a big no-no. This is a big problem. And so oftentimes, even in a product, if you're marketing a product and you are to write the name of the product in red, or the person who created the product in red ink, you could run into some problems. Each country is going to have their own specific idiosyncrasies in regards to this written language distinction. Language is also spoken, and there are several issues that could potentially be considered here. For example, whether or not the language is your native tongue, whether you actually sound fluent, or whether you have a basic understanding. The quality of interpreter that you have is also something that you would have to be concerned about, and not necessarily in regards to whether they studied or not to speak the other language, but whether or not they have an understanding of the other system. And often that's the problem that can be created. For example, in Asia, in most Asian countries, we find that there's a distinction in the way that we count, or that we make accountability for specific things. So for example, again, my experience being mostly in Southeast Asia, when you enter into a building in the United States, the ground floor is typically considered the first floor. So we've made this decision culturally to start counting at 1 when we're talking about buildings. But when we're born in the United States, we're 0. And you have to actually live 365 days before we consider you 1. So we're counting from a base of 0. Well, that's not consistent. That's not universal. Okay. In fact, we find a flip-flop going on in Cambodia where you're entering a building, you're on 0 floor. So if you have a business meeting, I've made this mistake, and it's in room 204, my mind quickly says from a Western perspective that I'm going to be climbing 1 flight of stairs because my base is naturally 1. And then I end up not being able to find the room. Okay? So these types of things in spoken language can cause problems if you're not familiar with the systems and you have an interpreter that doesn't really relate to that. Okay? There's also technical terms. Medical terminology oftentimes can cause problems here too with spoken language. For example, the way that you actually translate seizure, to have a seizure in Cambodian, would translate directly into English as crazy pig. Okay, as a pig is crazy, it's shaking, and they've translated that into a medical term that is actually now related to seizure. And so these are some idiosyncrasies with that country, but each country has their own idiosyncrasies to consider. In spoken language, you also have to consider expressions and emphasis. So when you give the different emphasis inside of a sentence is actually quite critical. And this is not something that is consistent throughout cultures. In fact, the dynamics of speech itself is something that we find quite distinct between cultures. So whether or not we even desire the dynamics inside of someone speaking is a place we should maybe start in discussing. So oftentimes when you hear professors speak or listen to a talk, if you get done and you're talking to a friend and they say, "How was it?" One of the first things that, in my experience, people will compare how it was to is whether or not the speaker had some sort of dynamic speech. Okay. In fact, when they're not, they say, "Oh, he spoke in monotone." Okay. And this is typically seen as something that is undesirable in Western cultures. That's not necessarily the case in Eastern cultures. Having a controlled tone without dynamic speech can be seen as a more maturity. Okay. Whether or not you're aggressive in your speech, whether or not your emotions come through in your speech, this can be good or bad. It's not universally agreed upon that one way is right. As you can see, there are a lot of issues here in spoken language. This is really just a short listing. And depending on the country that you pick, there are going to be unique qualifiers that you can consider. Also, body language. This is a very critical area, specifically because remember that we're not just talking about the distinctions that exist between countries, but you need to be able to make them relevant in a business type application. So why does this matter for business? You always need to keep that in mind as your context. So body language is very critical, and oftentimes we find very distinct between the East and the West. Now I'm talking Far East and West, so Asia, not the Eastern United States and Western United States, okay? So for example, let's look at some specific examples. The thumbs up concept, okay, whether this is seen as, a good deal, like thumbs up, not hitchhiking a ride, but you're good, good to go, no problems, that type of thing. How we gesture with hands, whether we're gesturing with hands at the same time we're speaking, or if we keep those things distinct. Sometimes that can be seen as rude if you're doing them at the same time. But if you do one and then the other, sometimes that's considered to be more polite. The way that you greet each other, whether you have eye contact when you're speaking, whether you have eye contact when you first meet each other, whether or not you smile. Smiles can be seen as interpreted different ways. Sometimes in Asia, a smile means you're embarrassed. This is actually a Cambodian word which is relating to what you see over here in this picture. And a lot of Southeast Asia specifically, this is something that's done culturally to show respect. And so you put your hands together, and specifically how high you raise your hands to your face has a specific meaning. Now, this is a dance picture right here, and that's why she has it here on her chest. So how high you raise your hands on your face signifies a level of respect to the person that you're speaking to, with kind of an equilibrium point at the nose. So if you're talking to someone younger than you, then oftentimes your hands only come to your chin, for example. And if you are expected to understand the culture and you're in a business meeting and you make that mistake, that could potentially cause some problems. Handshakes, Western handshakes, most of Asia accepts the handshake. Sometimes it's not seen as primary, but it can be a secondary type greeting. Most of the time in Southeast Asia, you first greet with the sampea, and then you can do a handshake. Whether or not the handshake is firm, whether or not it's with the right or the left hand, these are ideas that you should consider. The left hand in most of Asia is considered your dirty hand. And so even if your right hand is occupied in holding something, you shouldn't extend your left hand as kind of a last claim to greet someone. You should wait until your right hand is free. Okay. Ideas about, for example, transferring a gift or money. In Southeast Asia, when you hand money to someone, it's polite to hand it to them with both hands. In fact, it's rude. You're establishing superiority with someone if you hand them money and you only hand it to them with one hand. In America, I very seldom see people hand money with two hands. This is very common for us to do it with one hand, and so that can be problematic, specifically in a business type setting. Posture with body language is very critical, and not just how your posture is, but the relative way your posture is to others, and an ordering can be critical. So, for example, coming into a business meeting and considering who sits down first, or whether or not there's an invitation to sit down before you sit down, and all of these little rules about who it is that decides when you sit down. In Cambodia, a lot of times you're sitting on the ground. In a lot of Asia, you sit on the ground, even in business meetings. And if a person is sitting in a chair above everyone else, this is seen as either being superior to or being rude, depending on the situation. Also, the bottom of your feet, which in a lot of these countries, you're barefoot. Even in business meetings, you're barefoot a lot of the time. So if the bottom of your feet are pointing directly at someone, this is seen similar to flipping the bird in American culture. This is a very big no-no. Okay. Other types of body language, fidgeting, whether this is seen as being nervous, whether this is seen as being controlled. Again, the use of hands with your mouth. Personal space seems to be a big issue. Lots of studies have verified that there seems to be a very strong correlation between the personal space that we are comfortable, being with others, and whether or not our country is densely populated. So, for example, in Mexico City, a very, very densely populated city, people are actually more comfortable standing in close proximity to others. Whereas if you get into an area that's less populated in density terms, you're going to find that not to be the case. Okay? Always considering what is polite and what is rude. These are very critical concepts when we think about body language. Now let's take a brief look here at 6 fundamental patterns. Again, this is one perspective. This is one way of thinking through things from a literature perspective. This is certainly not something you have to adhere to, but it does seem to kind of aggregately or comprehensively consider several topics that perhaps you may be interested in including in your studies. So as a bullet point list here, we're going to look at communication styles, attitudes towards conflict, approaches to completing tasks, decision-making styles, attitudes towards disclosure, and then finally approaches to knowing. Let's start here with the first one, which is communication styles. So obviously there's a distinction between different cultures in regards to how they are going to communicate with each other. Okay, something to consider is the strength of phraseology. Okay, so for example, the word yes typically translates from a Western perspective to an Eastern perspective, but the meaning behind it is not necessarily as clear. For example, in Cambodia, again, we find that oftentimes yes is used to say, I heard you. Even when questions are asked specifically, even for an agreement to do an action, they can say yes without agreeing to the action. The yes actually means that they heard what you said, okay? And you would need to, again, ask them to do it in a different way. So these types of things are very critical, especially when you're talking about a business setting. You may think that they've agreed to some sort of contract or a deal, when in fact they were just indicating that they heard what you said. Also, there's an importance given to this nonverbal communication. So again, the seating arrangements, the personal distance, and sense of time. This is a very critical issue, especially when we think about business meetings, okay? So if we have an appointment at 10 o'clock here with some business clients, and we're here, say, on the West Coast in Los Angeles, and 10:10 rolls around, and the client has yet to show up, we might start getting antsy, okay? 10:20's here, we got a problem, and we're going to have to make some phone calls. They obviously forgot, or some other issues occurred, because 20 minutes, that's just too much time, okay? That's not the case everywhere in the world. In fact, you don't even have to move from the United States in order to see some variance with that issue. Okay, you go to Hawaii, they're going to have a completely different concept than if you're in the East Coast. So this is an issue you do need to be aware of. And in Asia, things work a little different in regards to sense of time. In my experience, it has a lot to do with perhaps geography and how hot it gets in the middle of the day. You often find that school, and this is again in Southeast Asia, but school and government buildings, most businesses will shut down for the really hot 2 hours of the day. People just seek shade and try not to die, okay? So this is something where I think it's kind of built into the system where people have become just slower paced. And so if you're 20 minutes late to a business meeting, this is really no big deal, okay? When you invite someone over to dinner, they come over sometime between 4 and 6. They often don't even think of it in regards to what time of day it is. They show up when they're hungry. So these are different concepts that you need to be aware of and sensitive to if you're going to conduct business abroad. Let's look at the second one here, attitudes towards conflict. Now, this is quite critical and quite important. Conflict is certainly going to occur, not just in personal relationships, but when we're considering business, okay? Whether there's a disagreement, a miscommunication, whatever the origin of the conflict, how we actually go about resolving conflict is very critical. Do you approach the person face to face? How much time do you wait between the occurrence of an event that is considered to be conflictual and a resolution? Is there a period of time that needs to pass prior to approaching the issue, or should you approach it right away? Okay, open conflict often in Asia is not something that's as desirable or seen as praiseworthy. In fact, specifically the way in which you do it, the other people that are around when you try to resolve conflict is a critical component to consider. So this concept of losing face, which Americans typically talk about in regards to being embarrassed, this is often seen as a very, very low reality to experience. Okay, it's not just a temporary embarrassment. This is something that can last with them for years, sometimes their life, if they're embarrassed in public. This is a very big deal to most Asian cultures. So the way that conflict resolution takes place from country to country or from culture to culture is a critical component to consider. And if you have questions about this, and this is something you're really serious about pursuing in your life, you should be asking questions prior to acting, okay? Ask people in that culture how they handle it. Don't assume that you know. Let's look at the third, approaches to completing tasks. The first thing to consider here is that different cultures have different types of access to resources that are available, okay? So we find that a lot of Asia now is gaining access to, even the poor countries are gaining access to the internet. It doesn't work very fast yet unless you're in Thailand, in Southeast Asia anyways, but they still do have access to it. And because of that, we're finding things are changing very rapidly. But we still do find a lot of deeply embedded concepts of how we go about approaching or completing a task that come from historical ways of completing tasks. Okay, so the reward for completing a task, what is that reward? Is it financial or monetary? Is it a title or recognition? Or is it some sort of personal self-satisfaction? And these are concepts that need to be considered. Again, the notion of time, this pops up in lots of different areas, but how long you should take to accomplish certain types of tasks, how much thought should go into it, the rank or hierarchy of which tasks take precedence, which ones are more critical. These lists may not be side by side completely equivalent or egalitarian from culture to culture. Also, the concept of whether or not you should be accomplishing a task by yourself, or whether or not you should be including a group. And oftentimes the independent orientation is something that is a Western ideal, whereas completing with a group, the orientation seems to be something that is more from the East. There's a great way of perhaps even modeling this. There's one economic paper published several years ago that looked at a modeling of independent versus group orientation contingent on how people in each country or culture played the game of hacky sack, okay, a game that originated actually from the East. Now, how you play that game is different in different countries, but what we do find is the scoring mechanism, or how we perceive a win from the game of hacky sack, is something that is very close to each country's concept of whether or not group or independent orientation should be dominant. So, for example, in most Western cultures, we find that while there is some group effort, we're looking at scoring and an individual shine and be able to do more tricks or kicks or whatever it is, and that person will stand out. And that's a critical component to the modeling system that's typically used in the West. Whereas the concept of collective group effort and everyone gets the same score is something that we often see more frequently in the East. Let's look at the fourth, decision-making styles. How we go about making decisions, whether or not we have some sort of delegation process to someone who is considered to be a subordinate, okay? Whether or not, if there's a group that will all be impacted by a decision, what system are we using here to make a decision? Okay, are we using some sort of democracy process where we vote on it and the majority wins? Are we using some sort of hierarchy system where the oldest person has the say? Do women get a vote? Okay, we shouldn't consider that just because women can vote in the United States and most Western cultures, that this is something that even if women can vote for an election, say, are they actually allowed to vote inside of other circles, okay, whether it's the workplace or the home or whatever it may be. So these are things to consider as well. Let's look at the fifth here, attitudes towards disclosure. This is something we often see that is quite distinct from Western cultures and Eastern cultures, okay? So for example, the display of emotion. So depending on which emotion we're talking about, oftentimes happy emotions are seen as, this is great, that person's fun to be around, they're showing that they're, quite happy. And if you're showing too much happiness in Eastern cultures, this can actually be perceived as bad, okay? Whether or not you disclose your emotion is culturally determined. While there's variance inside of cultures, we see some specific patterns in certain types of countries and cultures. Whether or not you disclose sexual behavior, this is another distinction here, okay? Oftentimes we find scandals, or we'll use that type of terminology, a very strong classifier, when business relationships go sour because of someone's sexual promiscuity. Whereas in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, it's not seen as something that is a negative for a male figure specifically to have, mistresses on the side. This is perceived completely different. Also, in regards to disclosure, Westerners are very discreet about income, whereas in some Southeast Asian countries, this is one of the first questions that's asked when you're meeting someone. How much money do you make? That would be very rude to do here in the United States. Well, this is very likely to be a question if you conduct business in Southeast Asia that you will encounter all of the time. You know, a disclosure of income. Now, it's not saying you have to disclose it, but that's part of what they do in their culture. It's a very frequently done thing, okay? Gender roles. Now, specifically, I'm not saying sex roles, okay? I'm talking about gender roles. And while some people consider sex and gender to be the same thing, in economics, we often will apply a very specific type of reasoning behind gender that doesn't apply to sex, meaning the following. If you're born male, that is your sex, okay? But the societal roles that are assigned to being male is your gender. And that can change from country to country. Whereas being male, actually being born as a male, does not change from country to country. So gender is something that is culturally determined, whereas sex is not culturally determined. So when we're talking gender here, each country has specific gender roles. And whether or not these things are talked about in disclosure is something to consider, but you should be aware of what is acceptable for males and females inside of each culture. And finally, number 6 here, approaches to knowing. Now, this is a very basic or rudimentary way of categorizing this. It doesn't do it much justice. This is an entire field in its own right. But if we were to very myopically, if you will, classify the different types of approaches to knowing, we could say that in the West, we typically have this, what we call cognitive approach, meaning that if I want to know something, I'm going to go figure it out by using a counting or measuring approach. So I'm going to go do the math, or I'm going to go do the research in academic literature, or I'm going to go ask the specialist in that field. These types of things, okay? In Africa, oftentimes they use what's called the affective approach, which they will look for answers more in symbolic imagery. They'll look for rhythm or music. They'll look for things in nature, etc. Okay. In Asia, oftentimes, specifically if we're talking about a Buddhist type religion that is also prevalent inside of their culture, you're going to find this striving approach where your approach to knowing is contingent on your move towards transcendence. And that's going to, instead of leading you to perhaps a book, you may be looking more towards meditation or more towards talking to an elder in your society or something like that. So where we go for answers, these are types of things that we need to consider as well when we're looking at a business model distinction between something in the West and something in the East. Okay. Now you were asked to look for a critical cross-cultural issue. We've talked about several that qualify as being cross-cultural. How do you know if it's critical? Okay, so here's a qualifier that you can use in order to satisfy this requirement for the task in it being a major difference. Okay, so the litmus test is as follows. Ask yourself this question: is knowledge or implementation of the cross-cultural issue that you've identified critical to the success of business in this country? Okay, now more than just performing the litmus test for yourself, make sure that when you present the information in your work or in your paper, that you make this apparent, okay? Show how it is critical, make it applicable to this business type model. Okay, let's talk about element B of the task. Here you were asked to compare U.S. business practices to practices in whatever country that you have selected, so your proposed country, for each of the following, and these are called the 4 Ps. We have product, price, promotion, and place. So one thing I want to discuss here, make sure when you look for these 4 Ps that you're specifically looking in chapter 17, pay attention to, starting on page 499, the product, price, promotion, and place titles. Make sure you're familiar with all of those. And also please note that you're not required to actually create a full-scale marketing plan, if you will, but instead you're going to take each of these 4 Ps separately that are part of this marketing mix and individually address them and make them applicable to this business concept. Let's start with product. This is, as you see here in quotes, the central focus of the marketing mix. Why? Well, it's what you're selling. It's critical that there's a demand for the product. It's critical that you're aware of several components about the product if you're going to be selling it in that country. So you may want to consider, for example, product designs and attributes, okay, contingent on perhaps, say, religious symbolism or the quality parameters, okay, whether or not there are some sort of overarching bodies, perhaps in social regulation here in the West, as we call it, to say, hey, when you produce a product, it needs to meet at least this bare minimum threshold of standard, whether it's in pollution or the quality of the product, however you're going to measure that, okay? These are likely to be different from country to country, whether or not the parameters even exist. The technologies that are inherent, the production technologies, perhaps they're not available in specific countries. Expectations for product performance. Okay. Whether or not, if people are buying the product and it's not working, is there a warranty for it? After-sale service. Okay. Some sort of guarantee, insurance on the product. You also need to be concerned that there's, quote, appropriate packaging. The design and color of the packaging seems to be in East Asia, specifically in Korea or Japan, very critical. The way that something is actually presented, okay, its appearance, its aesthetic appeal, if you will. Brand names are also very critical. Okay? The company image, who was it that produced it, and the way that it was packaged, the entire presentation of the product, even from the outside, before you even get to the product itself. These are things that are all related in the category of product itself. Price. Here we need to consider price levels. Now, one thing to consider is that you need to consider that the purchasing power, so you see that down here, the triple P, this stands for purchasing power parity. And this is a way that you can adjust the dollar in one country to an equivalent monetary figure in another country, so that you can essentially use a cost of living calculation or something like that to say, a dollar here is worth X amount in another country. And consider their ability to purchase specific products. If you're selling to a country that the GDP per capita, for example, is $6,000 to $10,000 per year, and you're selling a product that costs $5,000, perhaps you need to consider that there might not be a demand for your product. You also need to consider taxes and tariffs, and this is related to transporting or getting the product in as well, which we'll see in a moment. But this is also something that may increase the price of the product as you move through the boundary of country to country. Usually when you go through a border crossing, there's the possibility of having some sort of tax or tariff applied to the product. Also in price, there's a perception of value that comes in tandem with the price that it's charged. Each culture has their own concept or conceptual design in regards to discounts or secondhand products. Okay? In the United States, we have quite a variety, quite a distinction in regards to products that are discounted or products that are considered to be secondhand. And these are two different things, obviously. Okay? Something that's discounted is perceived as a great deal. We love sales. We bought it on sale. That's something we gloat over. Something that's secondhand may not be announced as readily, depending on where you're at throughout the country. Price-quality relationship. Oftentimes, paying a higher price in East Asian countries, in Japan and South Korea specifically, is seen to have a higher quality. Regardless of whether or not quality is really there, it seems to be something people are more willing to pay for, whereas a sale or discount is much more of an approach in the West. Whether or not you're standardizing prices would also be something you would need to be concerned about when you were setting prices for your product. If you offer a wide variety of prices for the same product in your domestic or foreign fields, then you may find that your product is actually repackaged and sold by another distributor. So you have to be concerned about whether or not prices are standardized when you cross this international border. Promotion is another one of the 4 P's. And here you may want to consider some of the following. The avenues that you pursue for promotion. Ultimately, you need to be able to say, hey, I need to effectively get this message out. I need to be able to communicate this effectively. How do I do that? Well, you may be aware of how it's done here, but that may not be the same way that it's done somewhere else. Okay, so for example, you consider advertisements. Okay, whether or not you're using brochures or the billboard or something on the internet or just on TV ads. Okay, the way that you actually advertise your product may be completely different. Even if it's the same product in the West and the East, you may actually describe it different. You may advertise it different depending on the appeal for the product in advertising motives. So, descriptive advertising, how descriptive you are about it, whether you announce the brand names, what details you talk about, whether or not you try to involve emotions in the advertising of the product, or if you keep them separate from emotions. Is it acceptable to bring in humor? Okay, is the concept of selling a product with sex, is that acceptable? And the answers to that will be obviously distinct from culture to culture. Is it okay to be explicit? Now, oftentimes we'll find that these two things don't go together. A lot of cultures that are okay with sex-based advertising don't allow explicit advertising. So those are two different concepts entirely. In Southeast Asia, the billboards that you'll find that announce where hospitals are that are competing against each other will actually show pictures that are very graphic in detail so that you're very aware that when you're hurt, like you see on that picture, then you need to come to this place. And we don't see pictures like that on billboards in the United States, although we do see a lot of sex-based advertising. Use of symbols, whether you're using the Marlboro Man, whether you use KFC, or in some countries they don't sell chicken, but it's more of a fish-based or KFF, whether you're using Nike, Nestle ads, these types of things. Also, something here with promotion that you need to consider and probably consult with someone that's in country that's very familiar with the culture is, how is this picture perceived? You can look at a picture, you can use that picture in advertising, and a different culture would understand it entirely different. They would get an entirely different message. And oftentimes when messages are portrayed through the advertising avenue, they will consult some sort of expert or someone who's familiar with the other culture and say, what do you get out of this ad? How does this ad make you feel? Does this make you want to buy the product? And depending on the culture you're in, you may have to adapt the pictures that are actually shown in your promotion or in your advertising campaign. Finally, let's look at place. Notice we're also talking about distribution here. When you're distributing, you may want to consider for local partners how you're going to distribute the product inside of the domestic sphere. Okay? Are there main roads? This is something to consider. Do you have freeways, highways? Can you get big trucks inside the country? Okay? Is it legal to transport products across the country? When you're looking at international distribution, you may want to consider the partners that you have internationally and how you actually get products from point A to point B, and how you're going to have to finesse the legalities of that or the geography of that. The geography ends up being a quite critical component of place or distribution. Depending on the Asian country that you select, you may or may not have access to a seaport, for example. Okay? If you do, say you're somewhere in southern China, you're right next to the coastline. Getting the product there would be much easier than, say, if you picked Mongolia for your country. Mongolia is landlocked, and there's no way that Mongolia can just access a seaport. You have to go through another country. That makes it much more cumbersome and difficult to consider this portion of business practices. Okay? So landlocked is an issue. The climate is an issue. Okay? Not just because of it being hot or cold, but the terrain that is associated with the climate. Okay? Trade routes are also very critical. And then another thing in regards to place would be the extensive meetings that would be associated with certain places. Finally, let's consider element C of this task. Here you are asked to discuss two distinct ethical issues that you will need to understand and respect as your business expands into your selected country. Now, ethical is the critical component of this. Do not confuse this with element A of the task. And please note, all ethical cross-cultural differences also qualify as cross-cultural differences. However, not all cross-cultural differences qualify as ethical differences. That's the important distinction that needs to be understood. Look at it a little bit more specifically. An ethical difference refers to the way in which an action or activity is regarded as perfectly acceptable or ethical in one culture, but that same action or activity in a different country could be considered wrong or unethical. Okay, so your litmus test here is as follows. You ask the question, would the identified cross-cultural distinction warrant the punishment of law in one country, but not in the other? That's the question that needs to be asked here as the critical qualifier, or else it's just going to be considered another cross-cultural distinction, and then you end up having to go back and redo that part of the task. Let's look at a few examples here. Here's where a lot of the research that you need to do comes into play, because each country has its own idiosyncratic examples that need to be provided. If you're in East Asia, oftentimes Japan or South Korea, this first example of gift giving tends to be something that's very prevalent. So the story goes as follows here. In a lot of these East Asian countries, when you're conducting a business meeting, it's usually customary and considered polite to bring a gift for your potential business client. If you do that in the United States, that may be perceived as or considered bribery, and there are severe consequences and legal ramifications for bribery. Okay, so it's the same act in both countries or cultures, but one culture perceives it as right and the other perceives it as wrong. That's an ethical distinction. Okay, oftentimes patents fall into this same category, whether you need to get permission in order to copy something. Okay? A lot of the Southeast Asian countries don't have copyright laws. Another one that you may want to consider are child labor laws. So if you're promoting a product, your product, say for example, and in East Asia, it's completely acceptable for you to show children at the age of 12 or 13 or 14 working in factories, full-time labor, and you're to use that same type of advertising campaign here in the United States, we would perceive that as being something that's wrong. Okay, so we can flip it around. The right or wrong component doesn't have to be in the east or the west. It doesn't matter which direction you present that. But so if it's wrong in the United States, such as gift giving or bribery, let's use a counterexample and make it wrong somewhere in Asia. Most of you will probably remember not too long ago the example of the Americans spitting in Singapore and getting lashes. Okay, now here's a critical aspect of this. Spitting isn't necessarily considered right in the United States, but it's not punishable by law. And that's where the threshold is drawn, okay? If there are legal consequences in one country but not in another, that's where the line is drawn and it qualifies as being an ethical example. So spitting in public in the United States, you're not going to land in jail for, whereas in Singapore, there are dire consequences for that act. Thank you for attending. This concludes our presentation of EGT1, Task 4. From the economics team at WGU, happy studies. Goodbye.